The Roman philosopher Boethius claimed that there are two elements to education. Theta, the theory, and pi, the practice. And neither is of any value without the other. I first read Boethius my freshman year here at Tufts. As a thinker stuck inside an engineer's body, I needed to do something to keep myself sane. Up until college, I really preferred reading and writing over math and science, easily. However, as the daughter of two engineers, I also grew up with the understanding that math and science are imperative to problem solving in the real world today. So, when I applied to Tufts, I applied to the engineering school, and when I started here, I felt completely outside of my comfort zone. Instead of reading dense texts and writing long papers, I was making hefty use of my Texas Instruments graphing calculator and working on what seemed to be endless problem sets. That said, I still felt that it would be most worthwhile for me to study engineering here at Tufts. I felt that by learning to see and solve problems as an engineer, I would make the most out of my higher education. It was something brand new after all. It's quite possible that I wouldn't have extracted this particular moral from Boethius's work if I hadn't already started my education as an engineer when I read it. Theta and pi. Theory and practice must be utilized together. Ideas must be actionable, and actions must be grounded in ideology. That said, even today, when we look at our campus here, we see that the School of Arts and Sciences nurtures brilliant thinkers, whereas on the other hand, the School of Engineering manufactures productive doers. When faced with many of today's modern problems, some of which have been offered up here today, we see that liberal artists ask and answer the question, why do these problems exist in the first place, in theory? Whereas engineers are more or less held responsible for fixing them in practice. As it stands, these two disciplines sit on opposite ends of the spectrum, leaving a massive gap of understanding in between. The purpose of my talk here today is to have us reevaluate how we've been approaching problem solving thus far in the real world. I'm here to argue that liberal artists and engineers must meet somewhere in the middle in order to ground themselves in both theory and in practice. Thus far, we've really only talked about the philosophy behind theta and pi. Essentially, we've discussed the theory behind this newfangled approach to problem solving. However, we certainly can't stop there. So instead, I invite you to come along with me on a brief little journey together. I'm going to now introduce a problem that I think is going to require this kind of interdisciplinary approach. And together, we're going to come up with a solution that's grounded in both theta and in pi. As we proceed on this adventure, I encourage each and every one of you to really critically consider how imperative theory and practice are every step along the way. So let's begin, shall we? Today's problem of choice is endemic disease in the developing world. As is common knowledge in the liberal arts community, endemic diseases such as malaria, dengue, and cholera inhibit economic development. So now if we put ourselves in the seat of a liberal artist, we should ask ourselves the question, why does endemic disease inhibit economic development? So let's answer it. First and foremost, what's important to note is that unlike epidemic disease, which happens in short, unexpected outbursts, endemic disease is constantly there. When citizens are constantly sick, they are unable to go to school and to work. When children can't go to school, they inhibit their ability to achieve a better quality of life for themselves. When adults can't go to work, they inhibit their ability to accumulate wealth, and furthermore, to achieve a better quality of living not only for themselves, but also for their families. When entire societies are sick, entire societies suffer, and as a result, entire nations are unable to lift themselves up and proceed towards economic growth. With this understanding, liberal artists have deemed endemic disease as a problem worth solving. They've developed solutions based off of their understanding, and then they've hired engineers to help implement them. Irrespective of discipline, be it theory or practice, most agree that prevention is the only sustainable control option when it comes to endemic disease. Infrastructure interventions, such as water, sanitation, and hygiene. the very basic necessities of life, serve as a very promising way to achieve this kind of prevention. Unfortunately, however, most developing countries simply lack the economic stability to offer this kind of infrastructure to the vast majority of their citizens. And as a result, liberal arts solutions have focused on making local infrastructure interventions more affordable by hiring engineering firms to make cheaper tubos and latrines, the primary methods by which water, sanitation, and hygiene can be improved at the local scale. That said, local scale interventions have not translated into nationwide coverage. And as a result, endemic disease remains rampant, inhibiting economic development in underprivileged countries worldwide. Thus far as we can see, most typically, liberal artists envision, theoretically, these brilliant solutions to these problems, and then they hire engineers to execute the solutions in practice. However, I'm here to argue today that if engineers were involved in the problem-solving process, they would be able to not only provide a different perspective on the problem itself, but be able to better inform how we use existing technologies in implementing solutions. So now, let's take another step forward and think about how an engineer might look at this problem. First and foremost, let's think of a very similar problem in the engineering context. Imagine this. How does a highway engineer decide where an extra traffic lane is going to be constructed, given a limited budget and a desired reduction in traffic? The answer is pretty simple, right? The highway engineer only performs construction in the areas that seem to be most traffic prone. Something that's less obvious, perhaps, is the fact that traffic is much like endemic infectious disease. It exists everywhere, but some areas are simply more susceptible to it than others. And from those susceptible areas, it spreads. Think about it. A car crashes on I-93 South, exit 18, which leads to this jam-up 20 miles away. A very similar sort of effect happens with infectious disease. So now, the truth is, if we could find the most disease-prone areas, the areas where disease begins and from which it spreads, we would be able to target interventions to that location and prevent disease before it can spread. And as a result, now the question becomes a very practical one. How do we find the most disease-susceptible areas? I recently started an initiative here at Tufts with 2 other students that aims to address this question, both in theory and in practice. We're called the Village Zero Project, and we've come up with this schematic called ghost mapping. The mapping of endemic infectious disease that is unseen and unheard, but is a chronic threat to livelihood. In theory, we envision that ghost mapping will be a technique that can be used in all developing countries for all endemic infectious diseases. But in practice, we're targeting cholera in Bangladesh. My parents both grew up in Bangladesh, and as a native Bengali speaker, I feel that Bangladesh is as home to me as Boston is. However, unlike Boston, upwards of 1 million Bangladeshis contract cholera every year. This keeps kids home from school and keeps parents away from work. In theory, we expect that if we could identify where index cases most commonly originate, a region we've coined as Village Zero, we should be able to perform interventions in that particular area, thus ultimately reducing annual disease incidence. In practice, using mobile phones to diagnose and plot disease outbreaks, known as mobile or mHealth, seems to be a very promising tool in actually identifying Village Zero. However, thus far, mHealth has really only been used to promptly provide treatment to the sick in times of unexpected disease epidemics. Now, as an engineer, I look at mHealth as a technology and I see that it can do much more than just that. It can be used for ghost mapping as well. It can be used to map endemic cholera as it propagates through Bangladesh, with the hope that such information will allow us to better inform prevention stratagems for subsequent cholera outbreaks. Ghost mapping will allow us to not only identify Village Zero, but it will allow us to target it with the appropriate interventions necessary to stop endemic disease outbreaks before they can spread. If this pilot project in Bangladesh proves effective, ghost mapping will be a tool that can be used in all developing countries to use the fewest